Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about the wide receiver strength of schedule for the 2022 fantasy football season. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the channel, you'll know how much I prioritize matchups in fantasy football. On a weekly basis throughout the regular season, there are a couple variables that may impact the overall success or failures of your fantasy prospects. Now, when we focus on the wide receiver position, we could talk about those variables being, ability in terms of skill, opportunity in terms of targets, whether that is in the red zone or on your own 1 yard line. We could talk about health and whether or not that player is able to play at a full capacity. We could talk about quarterback play. But one of the primary variables that a lot of people don't mention is matchups. The players that line up on the opposite side of the field, that their singular goal is to prevent your fantasy prospects from gaining yards and scoring touchdowns. So in order to give you more context, we want to go gather more information regarding these defensive players in order to give ourselves more insight in regards to the potential successes or failures that our wide receivers are going to see in the upcoming 2022 fantasy football season. Now, before we get into all that information, and there is a lot, before I divulge that and kind of break down how I found the wide receiver strength of schedule for this year, I want to go ahead and remind you guys, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Again, we are very close to surpassing 60,000 subscribers, another one of those great goals, but we're not stopping there. We're looking to crush that goal, get to 70, 80K this season. So if you have not yet already and you're trying to gain an advantage on your league mates, be sure to subscribe today and be sure to click the like button down below. I'd greatly appreciate that. Also, if you're trying to gain other advantages on your league mates, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Again, for those of you who haven't checked them out, another way to continue to get better this offseason is by drafting more. The more you draft, the more comfortable you'll be in those difficult decision-making processes that all of us have to face during a draft. So if you haven't yet already, be sure to travel to the description of the video, click the link, and travel to Underdog Fantasy. When you use promo code Andrew today and make a first-time deposit, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. But not only that, besides the deposit match, you'll also get an individualized email from me sent in your direction with my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings. Those rankings include positional tier-based rankings at the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defensive positions, along with my top 200 flex. This is for a half and full PPR scoring format. And besides getting the initial email, you'll also get subsequent emails every Saturday with updated rankings, so that regardless of when you draft between now and September 3rd, you'll have updated rankings to have an advantage on your league mates and help you potentially win a 2022 fantasy football championship, because that's the goal of this channel. So speaking of, let's go ahead and get into achieving that potential goal by divulging more information regarding the matchups at the wide receiver position and the strength of schedule going into 2022. So the statistics that you can see immediately to the right of me demonstrate how many points per game on average in a half PPR scoring format defenses allowed to opposing wide receivers. Now, if you went ahead and you saw yesterday's running back strength of schedule video, you guys remember that I went ahead and isolated the difference between running back rushing stats allowed and running back receiving stats allowed. I did the same here. I've gone ahead and isolated and removed wide receiver rushing stats. Players like Deebo Samuel, who were able to gather as many stats as they could on the ground. We've gone ahead and removed that and isolated the stats in regards to how many points defenses were allowing in terms of receiving stats alone, which include receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Now, as you can see on the very top of that list, we have the Minnesota Vikings followed by the Tennessee Titans and Baltimore Ravens. Just to give you some context, those are the teams that were giving up the most points last season to opposing wide receivers on a weekly basis on average in a half PPR scoring format. So Minnesota Vikings were giving up 33 points per week. Obviously, they couldn't stop anybody. Now, as you filter throughout this list, we see on the very bottom, we have the New England Patriots, Philadelphia Eagles, Buffalo Bills, who had some of the better secondaries and purely were able to stop a bunch of opposing offenses from scoring a boatload of points via their wide receivers. Now, we've also seen correlations at times where some of the teams that were giving up a bunch of points on the ground in terms of rushing stats often weren't giving up many points to opposing wide receivers because teams didn't really have to pass the ball often against them. They would mount early leads and run the clock out in the second half and vice versa. But either way, what I wanted to do is primarily present how bad some of these defenses were and how good some of these defenses were in terms of stopping wide receivers last year. Now, if you were going to take these statistics and throw it into our 2022 NFL schedule here, weeks 1 through 17, we would find that the Philadelphia Eagles, followed by the New York Giants, Washington Commanders, Dallas Cowboys, that entire division, the NFC East would have the easiest strength of schedule at the wide receiver position. And this is something that we're going to continue to see as we progress throughout today's video. Now, even though this is what it would look like if we were to take last season's defenses and put them on the field in 2022, that's not going to be the case. We cannot replicate that because there are going to be a lot of changes, whether it's injuries, rookies coming in, free agents, and trades. So we're going to go ahead and take another step further with this. I went ahead and isolated secondaries of all teams, all starting secondaries, whether it's your strong or free safety, your primary number 1 or 2 cornerback, your nickel. And I've also included some rotational players based on some offensive formations. You may need to have another secondary player come in. It is all dependent. But either way, I've gone ahead and taken every single secondary of all 32 teams in the National Football League, and I've gone ahead and taken their defensive coverage grades in 2021. Now, this also will include rookies. When I went to go ahead and collect data regarding rookies, I've taken the averages of past rookies based on what round they were selected in and how well they played in terms of coverage in prior years in order to determine their potential for success in 2022. Nonetheless, from what we can see and the stats that I've collected via grades in terms of coverage, we have found that the Jacksonville Jaguars, Houston Texans, Arizona Cardinals, immediately to the right of me, at the very top of the screen, have the worst average grades in terms of their secondaries going into the 2022 season. These are defenses that really don't have much, help in the secondary. And though they do have, some primary players here or there that are going to make plays, ultimately as an entire whole, as an entire secondary, these teams, typically struggle. Now, when we look at the other end of the spectrum, we look at the Buffalo Bills. We know how great those safeties are. Jordan Poyer, we're talking about Tre'Davious White coming back from an ACL injury. We talk about potentially the Green Bay Packers, who have the second best average grade in terms of secondary coverage. Jair Alexander is going to be at a full capacity this season. There is so much potential there, followed by the New York Giants, Tennessee Titans, Cleveland Browns, Cincinnati Bengals, etc., etc. But now that we've gone ahead and given some context as to the average grades of how these players produced last season, obviously this doesn't give us the full window of success. It doesn't give us a complete insight as to how they'll perform this upcoming year because players are going to sometimes improve and get better over their careers. Some are going to get worse. Some are going to get injured. And those different variables we can't take into account. But from what we've been able to collect, if we were to take this information and apply it to the 2022 full league schedule, weeks 1 through 17, we would find that the Las Vegas Raiders, followed by the Broncos, Falcons, New York Giants, Jacksonville Jaguars, would have the easiest strength of schedule at the wide receiver position. But though this information can be utilized for our overall success, what I wanted to do is continue to focus, continue to tweak this by throwing all the information that I gathered regarding number 1 cornerbacks and how well they played in specific matchups, followed by full secondaries, because again, there are some scenarios where you're going to have to be double covered. There's going to be a safety over the top. You're going to have less potential for success in those regards. But now that I've gone ahead and, kind of blended it all together, including the idea that some defenses primarily play zone coverage, like the Philadelphia Eagles, if it's their choice, they're going to sit in zone all day long. Darius Slay is going to be in that opportunity, and that is going to also be included in this. So with all of that, be sure to click the like button down below. Be sure to subscribe. Let's get into the wide receiver strength of schedule for the 2022 season. As you can see from weeks 1 through 17, again, please, I mentioned this yesterday, do not play in a week 18 championship. If you are a commissioner, please change that. If you are a player, remind your commissioner. Now, with that being said, what we have on screen here is the wide receiver strength of schedule for the 2022 fantasy football season. We'll have the Philadelphia Eagles followed by the New York Giants, Denver Broncos as the teams that have the easiest strength of schedule. Now, immediately, what pops off screen to me is the idea that A.J. Brown is going from a team that, obviously gave him a lot of opportunity. He played extremely well with Ryan Tannehill under center. Now goes to the Philadelphia Eagles. A lot of people are questioning whether or not he can transition from Tannehill to Jalen Hurts. Some people considering Jalen Hurts a, lesser quarterback in terms of a passing threat. But understand that his strength of schedule this upcoming season is extremely advantageous. And it's not by accident. Again, the New York Giants are in that conversation as well because, as we all know, schedules are very similar when we're talking about multiple teams in the NFC East. They often are going to play, the same schedule almost. And that's why we're going to see a lot of success from that specific division. But let's go ahead and let's mention other teams. The Denver Broncos up there, Jerry Jeudy, Cortland Sutton, a lot of potential there. The fact that Devontae Adams goes from the Green Bay Packers to the Las Vegas Raiders and his strength of schedule is going to be as easy as it is. I've already gone ahead and taken into account the fact that J.C. Jackson is most likely going to miss 2 to 4 weeks in this upcoming season. Added it to that combination, it's going to make a huge difference that we're going to end up missing, a couple primary cornerbacks in those early matchups because, again, the Las Vegas Raiders, they play against the Los Angeles Chargers week 1. And it's going to be exciting, but nonetheless, when we look at this, it gives us more insight as to what the potential of a 2022 season may be for some of our wide receiver prospects. Is this the end of the line? When we look at the bottom of the list, when we look at the fact that Rashad Bateman is going to have his hands full, so is Deontay Johnson, so is Elijah Moore, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase. Does this mean that we're avoiding these receiving options? Absolutely not. Yes, this adds to one of those variables, like I mentioned before, when we take into account quarterback play, opportunity, personal player skills, health, and then we also take matchups into account. When we look at the entire painting as a whole and what we've put together, it'll give us more insight, but it doesn't dictate our decision-making process. Because though, Rashad Bateman may have a tougher strength of schedule, it doesn't mean that they're not going to set him up for success. It doesn't mean he's not going to get 10 plus targets every single game. There's always possibilities of that still occurring and him continuing to find success. I mean, when I looked back at last season's strength of schedule, again, I think the toughest strength of schedule overall was claimed by the Cleveland Browns. Those wide receivers obviously struggled, but, near the bottom of the list were the Cincinnati Bengals last season. I think they had the third toughest strength of schedule last year. Guess what? They still were able to dominate because there are other variables besides matchups. Yes, the player skill may be able to surpass that. The quarterback play, if it's correct, will help that. But if you have too many negatives, then that's when it gets to a situation where we're a little bit worried. We look at the Chicago Bears. We look at the fact that maybe we can't trust a Justin Fields. The fact that his offensive line may not give him enough time to pass the ball. We look at Darnell Mooney. Yes, he is the only primary wide receiver on that team, which means he'll see more double coverages. When the conversation regarding a wide receiver's potential begins to snowball in a negative direction, that's when we potentially have to take, a step back, look at the entire, painting, and understand what is being shown to us. And understand that maybe those aren't the best investments, but when you have top-tier talent at the wide receiver position with a stud quarterback, a better offensive line, a lot of skill, we're not worried about these difficult matchups. Nonetheless, if you like, you can go ahead and pause this. Take, notes if you'd like. I know some of you do so, but we're going to go ahead and move on and go ahead and isolate segments of time throughout the season. Weeks 1 through 7, 8 through 14, and 15 through 17, which is the fantasy football playoffs, in order to give you some more perspective as to what we can anticipate this season. All right, so from weeks 1 through 7, we have it as such. The Philadelphia Eagles will maintain the easiest strength of schedule at the wide receiver position. Again, we look at some of these teams. Detroit, Minnesota. I know Washington, they do have a pretty strong number one cornerback. Jacksonville's going to be in trouble. Arizona's going to be in trouble. Dallas, Trayvon Diggs has, you guys can go look at the stats yourself, but I'm going to tell you first and foremost, he was in the top 3 in terms of giving up the most receiving yards to opposing wide receivers last season. There's a lot of yards given up by him. Yes, he's going to get himself interceptions, but hey, that doesn't bother my wide receivers as long as they're scoring fantasy points on a weekly basis. But ultimately, A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, they should be in a very prime position at the beginning of the year. Of course, followed by Michael Pittman Jr. We're so excited about his potential. Look at who he gets to play. Houston and Jacksonville in the first 2 weeks. Those are going to be some, blowouts in my opinion. Followed by the Kansas City Chiefs. That should be a shootout of sorts. The Tennessee Titans matchup, exciting. Denver, obviously they've got themselves a great secondary. Jacksonville again and Tennessee again. These are going to be great matchups overall. Either higher scoring or they've got extreme advantages at the wide receiver versus cornerback position. But though I could talk about a bunch of players ad nauseum continuously down this entire board, you know who plays for who, and you could see the matchups on hand. Of course, the first bye week start in week 6, so keep that in mind. It's already been taken into account. But when we scroll to the very bottom, when we look at the Baltimore Ravens, having still the toughest strength of schedule for the first 7 weeks of the season, they play against the New York Jets. If Sauce Gardner is as good as he's as advertised, then that should be a tough matchup for Rashad Bateman. Then he has to go again and play against Xavier Howard, Byron Jones from Miami. Then he plays against the New England Patriots. They've always got a great secondary. Then Buffalo, then Cincinnati. I guess Eli Apple could be, a good week for him. The New York Giants have been pretty decent. And then Cleveland, who, we know how great their corners are. Ward over there is not giving up much ground. So obviously the Baltimore Ravens, they're going to have their hands full for their early weeks. So are the Cincinnati Bengals, Tennessee Titans, Atlanta Falcons, all in that regard. So do with this information as you will. We're going to continue on and let's talk about weeks 8 through 14, the middle of the season. And by the time we get to the middle of the season, we could very definitely see teams that look completely different. Number one quarterbacks could be, have season-ending injuries. Number one wide receivers could be completely gone. But just giving you some more context as to what we may be looking for midway through the season in terms of players that, yes, may have tougher strength of schedules early on, but could eventually find their stride. Like a player that I'm thinking of off the top of my head is DeAndre Hopkins. Okay, DeAndre Hopkins does not play the first 6 weeks of the season, but he does come back in week 7. And what could we potentially see from weeks 8 through 14? What can he potentially, contribute to our teams based on the matchups? Again, they have one of the tougher strength of schedules. They're currently sitting there at the 25th ranked. Again, they play against Minnesota, Seattle, the Los Angeles Rams, San Francisco, LA Chargers. They hit a bye week, then play against New England. Again, you can get away with, some decent games against Minnesota. I know Seattle, their secondary played very well last season. They could very easily do so again. You got to play against a guy like Jalen Ramsey. I know DeAndre Hopkins is not backing down from that, but again, there are a lot of tough matchups in that streak of games that may be, tough to invest in DeAndre Hopkins that much more. I know he's a premier talent, but you have to take these things into account. Now, obviously, let's look at the top of the board. The Denver Broncos. This is one of the teams that I was extremely excited about when we talked about earlier, as the full spectrum of the 2022 year for the wide receiver position looked great. Courtland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy. Once they find their stride, their chemistry builds fully throughout the first month and a half of the 2022 season. They could very easily catch fire here from weeks 8 through 14 against Jacksonville. Then they hit a bye. But after the bye week, they're going to be in very competitive matchups and potentially some shootouts against Tennessee, Las Vegas, Carolina, Baltimore, and then Kansas City. These are very advantageous matchups for these kind of wide receivers, especially with great quarterback play presented. I'm excited about the potential. Let's talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars. Christian Kirk is a guy that is rising up draft boards this offseason. Yes, he's dealt with some injuries during training camp, but most recently we saw him get a lot of opportunity in that preseason game, and it's not by accident. They paid him a lot of money this offseason for a reason. So what is he going to potentially be in line to play against? And can he potentially take advantage of said matchups to elevate his play beyond where he typically is at? Of course, the New York Giants are still in this conversation. Kadarius Toney. We have the Dallas Cowboys, CeeDee Lamb. Hopefully, fingers crossed, you're going to be the primary guy that is catching the ball, 6-7 times a game and dominating on a weekly basis. Now, in comparison to where the Atlanta Falcons were from weeks 1 through 7, they had one of the tougher matchups. Now, hopefully for Drake London, by the time he gets to week 8, he can be fully comfortable with Marcus Mariota. But what I want to mention in regards to rookies is that there is a lot of rookie fatigue. Again, we got to remember, the first year for a rookie is probably the toughest year of their career, because they go from playing college football to the Senior Bowl in some circumstances, going to immediately prepping for the combine. After prepping for the combine, they go to optional training camp, OTAs, the rookie training camp, all this kind of stuff. And then they hit training camp, and then they have to immediately play a full season. There's no rest time for rookies. So I'm always, looking for rookies that have great matchups later on, because that they're going to, break down relatively early. I know Jamar Chase defied all the odds last season by being able to play a, full season, obviously getting to the Super Bowl. But oftentimes you got to be worried about some of these rookie options, because they could eventually fall victim to some injuries because they've had so much stress on their body over the last year. Nonetheless, take this information as you will. Of course, the New York Jets, Cleveland Browns, Houston Texans on the very bottom. For many of us, those wide receiver options, are lower in our rankings. Again, we're talking about Brandon Cooks, Amari Cooper, Elijah Moore. They're way further down the board. But when you think about the matchups, again, you have to understand that some of these primary wide receivers are still going to end up with 10 plus targets in a singular game. And the reason why that's going to happen is because there really isn't anybody else to throw the ball to. Again, Elijah Moore is the number one, followed by Amari Cooper being the number one of his team and Brandon Cooks on his. Yes, Nico Collins could, step up. Donovan Peoples-Jones, maybe Garrett Wilson for the Jets. But ultimately, as long as you're the number one wide receiver and you're given that opportunity, the matchup shouldn't scare us off too badly. Moving on. Let's talk about the fantasy football playoffs, weeks 15 through 17. I will once again mention it. If you have not yet already, be sure to change your league settings to have a week 17 championship. Please do not play in those league settings in which your championship consists of week 15 and 16 combined and 17 and 18 combined. Again, there are teams in week 18 that have made the NFL playoffs in actual football, right? The number one seeds of their divisions, or have clinched a wild card spot and don't need to win in week 18, and they're going to just let their players sit because they have nothing to play for. When you get into those circumstances, you may be in trouble for fantasy football, so be sure to have week 17 as your championship week. Now, when we look at this entire board, seeing as to who has the best and worst matchups at the wide receiver position, we have Drake London at the top. Again, Sutton and Jeudy next to Cleveland Browns. Again, with Deshaun Watson coming back and Amari Cooper being at a full status, hopefully at that point. And, we talked about it yesterday, Nick Chubb having the toughest strength of schedule in the fantasy playoffs. They're going to have to throw the ball a bunch, and that really does help the potential of one Amari Cooper. The Houston Texans jump up back to the top. Kadarius Toney and the New York Giants. again, there aren't too many big name wide receivers. We're not seeing, Debo's, CeeDee Lamb's, Stephon Diggs thrown into this conversation, Mike Evans. Like they're in that middling pack. But again, this is really just to help some of those wide receivers that are on the fringe, wide receiver 2s, wide receiver 3s that we're not 100% certain on. But by the time we get to the fantasy football playoffs, we could have a better idea as to what they're capable of, and who they're going up against could be the biggest difference maker between you winning or losing your playoff games and winning a championship in 2022. All the information here on screen should give you a little bit of context. Obviously, the Miami Dolphins on the other end of the spectrum, the toughest strength of schedule, playing against Buffalo, Green Bay, New England. Again, they will be busy, and they're going to have, those are 3 playoff games. Purely, they are. When you're playing in late December, early January, and you're going against Buffalo, Green Bay, and New England, I don't even know if those are home or away games. They're going to have a tough time at the wide receiver position, especially if there's weather concerns, which I'm sure there are going to be in Buffalo, in Green Bay, in Foxborough. Those are going to be some tough situations to deal with. We look at the Cincinnati Bengals. They take on Tampa Bay, New England, Buffalo. Again, if we're having weather concerns late in the season, we got to keep our fingers crossed that they're still able to, make an impact in those games. Of course, the Tampa Bay contest, I'm not too worried about. Depends on whether that is in Cincinnati or in Tampa Bay, of course. But ultimately, I trust in the talent of these wide receivers. Take this information as you will, add it to your plethora of stats and information that I've given you this offseason, stuff that you've done your own research on, add it to the Rolodex, and let's go ahead and let's make a final review here from our weeks 1 through 17 wide receiver strength of schedule for the 2022 season. Again, there's a lot of information here, and I know I threw a lot at you, and hopefully this just makes you more confident on players. Hopefully this doesn't make you avoid certain wide receiver options. Like when I look at the fact that, the Philadelphia Eagles have the easiest strength of schedule, it gives me excitement for an A.J. Brown. When I look at the fact that the Indianapolis Colts, the Los Angeles Chargers, these are teams that I'm already super excited about getting their wide receivers in the 3rd round, like a Michael Pittman Jr., a Mike Williams, a Keenan Allen. Again, these are all the 3rd round wide receivers that are typically coming off the boards. And the fact that you can get more confidence in drafting them, that's exactly what I'm looking to do when I find this information. So with all of that mentioned, if you enjoyed today's content and appreciate the efforts I put forth in gathering all those statistics and bring it to you guys, be sure to click the like button down below. It takes 2 seconds out of your day to also subscribe. Help us reach that goal of 60,000 subscribers here in 2022. Would greatly appreciate that. Also, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code Andrew today. Besides getting the first time deposit match up to $100, you'll also get my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings when you make that first time deposit using promo code Andrew today. So be sure to check that out. There's a link down in the description. Tomorrow, we have our yearly running back tier list video. Again, we've been doing this for the last couple years, and hopefully we'll be able to pack in as much information as possible so that if you're drafting in the next couple weeks here, you have all my thoughts on all these players and where I've ranked them in terms of a tier list going into the 2022 season. Thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.